been here before. We're a worker-owned, democratically managed bookstore and coffee house and coffee roaster and restaurant, and we've got a free school in the back there as well. Lots more information about all the stuff we're doing either on the calendar that's up here or the mailing list you can sign up for up here, or on our website, or any number of other innumerable social media channels that you can check out at your leisure. But tonight we're here to talk about Murray Bookchin. And Murray Bookchin, really, really interesting. We'll hear quite a bit about him. Just want to say personally why I'm really excited about this is that growing up and coming into politics as a teenage anarchist in West Philadelphia, Murray Bookchin, probably the first I ever heard of him was as the cranky guy who was annoyed that the anarchists were caring more about the blackness of their clothing and punk music than about good social politics. And so I might have had a biased interpretation at first, but pretty soon as I started getting involved with anarchist politics, with going to conferences, talking to folks, going to book fairs, it really started to dawn on me that like all the smartest people who seem to have the best ideas all had some connection to the Institute for Social Ecology, which Bookchin had set up and run and had trained basically a generation of anarchist thinkers who really spread ideas throughout what became the anti-globalization movement and beyond. And so it's really, really interesting to see the work of thought that went into really thinking very clearly and very rigorously about what anarchism meant at a particular historical moment, and thinking about the principles that went into anarchism and how to talk about them, how to spread them, how to go beyond anarchism to visions of Libertarian Municipalism, Social Ecology, and to really strike out in an original theoretical direction and outline really what freedom looks like in society. And so Bookchin's vision has been tremendously, tremendously important, and it's been influential as far as in places as improbable as the autonomous Kurdish regions, right? Currently in Syria, we're going to hear a lot about this tonight, I hope, but there's an amazing upsurge of the development of a free society under very, very adverse conditions. And improbably, this thinker from New England has had a lot to do with defining how those folks are understanding the revolutionary process that they're engaged in, which is, again, a remarkable testament to the reach and value of the ideas of Murray Bookchin. So tonight we have with us the editors of a brand new collection, Murray Bookchin, The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and the Promise of Direct Democracy, just out from Verso. It's up here for sale after the talk. We have with us Debbie Bookchin, who's a journalist, and Blair Taylor, who's a PhD student at the Freie Universität in Berlin. So please join me in giving them a hand and welcoming them to Red Emma's.
Mind-blowingly cool that it's so big and well put together. Thank you all for coming out. So we're going to talk tonight a little bit about who Bookchin was, his political project, his political ideas, and how they shifted and changed over time. And that's kind of a hard thing to do because, well, he wrote for over 60 years and published over 25 books ranging from philosophy, social theory, anthropology, political strategy, urbanism. And he's a very dynamic thinker who was always thinking in contrast and alongside the social movements of his day. So I'm going to try to trace the trajectory of his ideas, and to give an idea of some of his political development, I'm going to focus on 3 key phases of his project. And what I want to do is suggest that in a lot of ways he was quite ahead of the curve, that a lot of times the ideas and the politics and the theoretical moves he was making went rather unappreciated at the time, but became rather conventional wisdom on the left, and certainly within the anarchist left, 10, 20, 30 years later. And I want to suggest that he's really, in very important ways, one of the key architects of the modern left, even if he's under-acknowledged. So first I want to start out by talking about his critique of Marxism and hierarchy. Murray's work was very much built by pounding on the stone of Marxism. He grew up a red diaper baby in New York, Jewish left, steeped in the old left traditions, And although he'd been writing since the 1940s for communist newspapers, it wasn't really until the 1960s that he found an audience for his work. And his project was to revive the revolutionary project in the wake of the decline of the old left and the collapse of the traditional labor movement. So when the new left finally comes around, we're confronting whole new historical conditions, a whole new host of issues, racism, sexism, an emerging gay rights movement, ecology, which didn't fit into the old paradigm of the old left and Marxism. So he was really trying to come up with a new theoretical apparatus. Class analysis was not just enough for him. So his counter concept that he comes up with is hierarchy, which in a way develops what was an implicit political inclination throughout the anarchist tradition, opposed to all forms of hierarchy, domination, all forms of oppression, but it really hadn't received a very coherent theoretical treatment until Murray started doing this in the 60s and culminating with his work post-scarcity anarchism. So, I mean, bear in mind at this time, even someone like Lucy Parsons was criticizing Emma Goldman during her day for talking about free love, saying this was a distraction from the class struggle. So he wanted to displace the classic, Marxian dyad of class exploitation, class society exploitation, with what he thought were the broader concepts of hierarchy and domination. He wanted to out-Marx Marx. I mean, Marx was always kind of the general theoretician of history. He wanted to step back a little bit and say, no, actually, you're only talking about economy. I want to talk about a much broader social dynamic throughout history. Actually, to hear him kind of put this critique in his own words, John, could you cue that clip? This is a clip from the American Anarchism documentary, and it was recently reposted in a great BBC blog by Adam Curtis, the documentarian, where he kind of talks about the connections between Bookchin and Öcalan and the PKK.
And the conclusion I came to was this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and I worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before the United would be there, when it was still on a very militant, stage in its development. But this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. But in point of the fact that factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them, and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of the conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact, had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served, in fact, to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function and adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views. Because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. So these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid, or if we are to avoid, the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life. We would have to turn to anarchism because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question not simply of economic exploitation, but exploitation in every sphere of life. And it was that growing awareness that we had to go beyond classes into hierarchy and beyond exploitation into domination that led me to anarchism and to a commitment to an anarchist.
So what he comes up with this master category of hierarchy is basically a fundamental rethinking of the contemporary anarchist project. And post-scarcity anarchism sums this up and gives one of the definitive statements of 20th century anarchist theory. Unfortunately, this went unheeded at the time. Even though the New Left began with these participatory democratic aspirations, by the late 60s you had this return to the kind of orthodox Marxism and Maoism that Murray had grown up seeing in the old left, and he was very familiar with all the problems of authoritarianism and whatnot. And at their final 1969 conference in Chicago, when SDS exploded and all these competing little Marxist sectarian groups, Murray was on the sidelines handing out a pamphlet called Listen Marxist, kind of pointing out that these categories and this political vision doesn't actually speak to the new conditions of the late 60s. And it unfortunately went unheeded at the time. However, what it had a large impact on was the successor movements in the 1970s and 80s, the so-called new social movements, the peace, feminist, ecology movements that turned to direct action, that tried to create a directly democratic culture in contrast to the authoritarianism of 60s Marxism and Maoism. And this, Murray was a very key figure in this. He was both theoretically and, in terms of political action, he was involved with this. And of course, these movements were the movements that would then exert a very strong, profound influence on the ultra-globalization movement. And they really are the folks that coined the term prefigurative politics, which Murray was already talking about. This Listen Anarchist, this pamphlet, ends with this call for a kind of political prefiguration. So the next major step, I think, in Bookchin's political development is super important, is to turn to ecology. And again, Murray was addressing a radically new historical context, which underlines some of the key limitations of classical Marxism. I mean, first, we saw the post-war era, you had abundance. You didn't have, the Marxist immiseration of two classes, increasingly radicalized until you had revolution. Rather, you had a rather complacent and well-funded working class that seemed to be growing inured to capitalism. So he was quite worried that politics based on class interests was proving to be very easily recuperated, and the working class was becoming more docile, not more revolutionary. So in a post-scarcity or a potentially post-scarcity society, what would be the new revolutionary dynamic? So he arrives at ecology, which he believes now is like a new possible revolutionary crisis dynamic. Key to this idea for Murray was that the ecological crisis was a social crisis. It wasn't, as Malthus and Malthusians had said, a matter of population. It wasn't a matter of technology. He was criticizing some of the conservative ideological underpinnings of groups like the Club of Rome, which were early folks talking about ecology. At the core of his critique of his notion of ecology was that capitalism was driven by a cancerous grow or die imperative. It grows, it grows, it grows, undermines the natural basis to sustain life itself, which would inherently lead to ecological degradation. I just want to read a short bit from the book, actually, on page 32, where he discusses this. The consequences of this grow or die market economy is to inexorably lead to the destruction of the natural basis for complex life forms, including humanity. It's all too common these days, however, to single out either population growth or technology, or both, to blame for the ecological dislocations that beset us. But we cannot single out either of these as causes of problems whose most deep-seated roots actually lie in the market economy. Attempts to focus on these alleged causes are scandalously deceptive and shift our focus away from the social issues we must resolve. So this is the first aspect, the new revolutionary dynamic that capitalism would undermine the ecological basis for survival. But secondly, social ecology, or what he called his particular ecological approach, posed that ecology posited a political and strategic advantage as well. And that was that, unlike Marxism, which was based on a narrow class interest, and the irony here being proletarians were always a minority, they were never a majority of any society, ecology, the possibility of generalized human devastation proposed a potentially trans-class issue that could unite people outside of these narrow class interests. And he was very concerned with this as he saw classes seem to be becoming more blurred. Class interest didn't seem to be such a motivating factor. So he's one of the first key theorists of ecology. He wrote his first book on ecology a few months. It was published before Rachel Carson, kind of widely recognized as the godmother of the contemporary ecological movements. He predicted global warming in 1965. He wrote very prescient lines about this and almost before anyone else. And in the 80s and 90s, he became a key interlocutor with deep ecology, which was growing at the time. He had debates with Dave Foreman, one of the co-founders of Earth First, who, it must be remembered, was actually a Goldwater Republican. This guy who was one of the main intellectual influences on one of the most radical left movements at the time, actually had roots in a conservative political position that Murray debated with quite vigorously. And actually that's how I came to social ecology myself, was as a, believe it or not, dreadlock Earth Firster in the Pacific Northwest. I came across this book where he kind of demolished one of my political heroes in debate. I was like, oh wow. So then I saved up and I studied the Institute for Social Ecology in the wake of Seattle and ended up here many years later. So then the last phase I want to talk about in Murray's political development, which kind of points us towards the 1990s, which is mostly the period when the books, the essays in this book were written and published, mostly in smaller journals that are out of print, which were collecting these, and there's also a few that are unpublished. His third phase was his debates within the anarchist community that eventually led him out of anarchism, caused him to break with anarchism. In the 90s, he saw a lot of these tendencies towards what he called lifestyle anarchism. Some of you are probably familiar with this book, Social versus Lifestyle Anarchism, that John was mentioning, this ferocious polemical attack that he made, which he thought that the social anarchist movement was losing its social component. It was just becoming focused on self-transformation, on individualist lifestyles, rather than building movements for social transformation. And he had heated polemics with Bob Black, also with primitivist anarchists like John Zerzan, which were kind of building on some of these deep ecology ideas. Hakim Bey, this idea of a temporary autonomous zone. It doesn't have to be a revolutionary break. We just have free street parties and freedom in the margins, and that's good enough. And he starts to lament the loss of some of those very old left values that he started out criticizing, in fact. The need for organization, the need for revolutionary rupture, enlightenment, universalism, and rationality. So he starts to distinguish his own project from anarchism and saying that anarchism's historical attention to freedom and its anti-statism is good, but it's not good enough. On the other hand, Marxism's uncritical embrace of using the state is also problematic. How can we institutionalize the forms of freedom? So he looks at the red line throughout revolutionary history of popular assemblies, going back to, well, he took inspiration in ancient Athens, despite the obvious problems of being a slave society, then looking at the Spanish Revolution, looking at the Hungarian uprisings, looking at the Russian Revolution, the Soviets, and why haven't revolutionary thinkers taken this incipient form and developed this into a political program? So this is where he starts to develop his own ideas, which he calls Libertarian Municipalism initially, and then later communalism, to build an anti-capitalist politics of direct democracy that avoids kind of the pitfalls of both anarchism and Marxism. Finally, after all these debates of 10 years within the anarchist milieu, of anarchists saying, hey, you're not an anarchist, he's like, okay, I'm out. I'll go do my own thing, I'll develop my own politics. And this politics of libertarian municipalism is now what Debbie's going to speak a little bit about.
I also just want to reiterate Blair's thanks to everybody for coming out on this really cold night. I lived for many, many years in Vermont. I know cold weather, but this is really cold. So it's great of everybody to be here tonight. So as Blair said, Murray, in some sense is probably best known for his work on ecology and especially, for example, the fact that he really introduced ecology back in the early 1960s as a political concept, perhaps really for the first time, talking about how we really had to transcend traditional class analysis type politics and look at ecology as something that every single person on the planet really can get excited about, and that really is a organizing force that we should be able to tap into. But at the same time that he was doing that, he was also, from the very beginning, concerned about the question of organization, what types of organization were going to be most useful, what types of organization could really bring about the social change that we all desired so much. And even as early as 1968, he wrote an essay called The Forms of Freedom, which was initially published in the magazine Anarchist, which we used to put out in New York, and which collected in the book Post-Scarcity Anarchism. And he says, a society based on self-administration must be achieved by means of self-administration. So that question of exactly how we can bring about this social change was something that occupied him throughout, but that he really started to focus on and write about extensively in the last couple of decades of his life. As Blair said, he became more and more, I guess you could say, disillusioned with anarchism, which he had really spent about 40 years really as an anarchist and appreciated many aspects of anarchism, but felt that in order to institutionalize the kinds of social change that we wanted to see, we also had to address issues of power, and that anarchists were very reluctant to do that. So he came up with this idea that he didn't come up with it, but he slowly worked his way into a new concept that he really had to distinguish from the traditional labels of the past, and he called it communalism. And the sort of political praxis of communalism is what he called libertarian municipalism. And in libertarian municipalism, he's talking really about how we can engage on the local level in our communities, working to institutionalize the kind of society that we wish to create, to make it directly democratic, to make it accountable, to make it transparent, to really empower people on the local level. And, you know, but also just to add, these community assemblies, these general assemblies, would confederate so that they're not parochial in any sense of the word, but that they would exist in confederation with others, so that people could also make decisions about regional issues and other shared questions of economy and ecological stewardship. And I think that, you know, one reason that Blair and I were excited to collect these essays now is particularly after Occupy, the Occupy movement, particularly after the amazing protests that we've seen really all in squares all over the world, you know, from Turkey to Athens. It raised the question of how do we move from protest to transformation? You know, how do we take this tremendous impulse for social change and these cries that we are hearing everywhere now for direct democracy and give them some kind of institutional form? And, you know, I was recently at the Left Forum in New York last spring, and you know, obviously that's a radical forum. There were tremendous panels, there were a lot of speakers, there was keynote addresses, and everybody kind of saying the same thing. You know, we have to organize, we have to get out there, we have to put our bodies on the line. Cornel West was talking about that. He was one of the keynote speakers. Other people. But the problem is that, in a sense, we activists have been putting our bodies on the line for a while now. You know, it goes back to the ultra-globalization movement to Seattle, to long before that civil disobedience. And the question is sort of where do we, how do we take those kinds of impulses and make it so that instead of just challenging the power of the state. We usurp the power of the state. And that's what Murray's really writing about in the 9 essays that are contained in this book. And that's what I think is something that could be actually very exciting right now for activists and leftists to embrace. And just to sort of give a little bit of an overview of what he talks about, he's first of all, obviously employing the notions that he respects so much in ecological thinking, diversity, and the sort of the notion of a web in which each aspect of an ecological system is important. He states that all of these organizations really have to be very respectful of individual differences, and that there has to be tremendous respect for differences of opinion and discussion and debate. And that's why he really talks about face-to-face democracy on a small scale, in small assemblies of people, and that these kinds of interactions will help. And by the way, he also includes the idea of majority voting, which he believes protects a minority point of view more than consensus, which can sometimes be used to, in a certain sense, coerce people into a point of view. And so that's one of the sort of key aspects, that these assemblies and the discussions and the decisions that are taken are always transparent, that people are accountable, that they are recallable, and he uses as a model the Athenian polis, which he acknowledges, of course, had many, many difficulties and problems, not the least of which was that it was a slavery-based society and that women didn't have rights. But it was a society that was obviously extremely constrained by the lack of technology at the time, by the social institutions of the time, but that this kind of democracy, grassroots democracy, has a real potential for us today, that it's something that we should look at and take the best from it and try and incorporate it in our own neighborhoods and communities in ways that are inclusive, so that every adult in a community has a chance to participate. And, you know, I think that for Murray, another thing that was very important was that people educate themselves in this process, and that he was a big fan of study groups. He held them constantly through, you know, his whole adult life for people in New York, in Burlington, wherever he was doing activist work, and that he sees also the process of libertarian municipalism as a kind of an educational process. In a certain sense, we have to relearn what it means to have this kind of grassroots, bottom-up democracy. And he was also a student of urbanization in cities and wrote many essays, but also books on urbanization in cities, and saw cities as a realm in which, at their worst, of course, giant megalopolises could be terribly oppressive, but at their best were really a forum, a free space, a place where people could recognize and realize their highest potential, in a sense, as human beings. And in the same way that the Greeks thought about the social sphere as the sphere in which we are truly able to, you know, use rational thought, to debate, to make decisions, to be empowered, to govern the future of our communities, that was very important for him. And we see now people like David Harvey and his wonderful book, Rebel Cities, also, you know, really embracing that notion of what the city can mean, and what, in Murray's case, what this kind of communalist, libertarian municipalist approach can mean. And so I just want to end, I think it would be great to have some conversation and discussion, but I just wanted to end by saying that one of the things that's been exciting has been to see how some of these ideas are being implemented in Kurdish communities, and that Murray had a distant but somewhat of a relationship, in a sense, with Abdullah Öcalan and his Kurdish, the PKK, effort to transform itself from a kind of a hardcore Marxist-Leninist organization into one that was much more focused on the idea of Kurdish autonomy, not necessarily creating a state, but actually empowering people on a local level. And he corresponded with Murray and requested Murray's books and read some of those books when he was in prison. And really, I think one of the things that was very exciting, I wish Murray were alive to see it now, is that because they started working on these issues many years ago, when the moment opened up in Syria, in that part of Syria that is the northern part close to the border of Turkey, which we all are now familiar with, Kobani being one of the communities that is a Kurdish-held community, they were ready, they were sort of ready to fill the breach. And one of the things that Murray advocates in this book and in general is that we sort of have to understand that these processes take time, and that to work in our communities, it doesn't mean we're going to have a revolution tomorrow. It doesn't mean that this change is going to come about as quickly as we might like, but that if we start to create these kinds of general assemblies or small assemblies, and then maybe even run eventually a candidate for local office, not state office, not national office, because we all know where representational politics leads us. You know, it supports the corporate nation state. But if we start to do that on a local level, then maybe the next time an Occupy moment presents itself, we will have structures in place that will help us actually contend, really, and contest the power of the nation state. So that's a little bit about what you'll find in the book, and we'd be happy to open up the floor for some conversation or questions. Please. Do you want to talk into the mic, or I don't know? Did you do that? Oh, okay.
Hi. You were talking about individual transformation, sort of that idea kind of being rejected in favor of looking at broader social scale. I'm sure there's a literature, but could you provide a brief criticism of that idea? Or I guess as Murray sort of approached it.
Recap his critique of what he called lifestyle anarchism? The individualism?
Yeah, can you define it first and then make sure it's fine?
Yeah, I think he just saw in the 1990s as anarchism kind of resurfaced as a rival tradition to Marxism, which had already been eclipsed by the 60s and was continuing on decline, at least in North America. It was a very punk rock inflected anarchism, and it was very much based on this DIY ethos. And even though Murray himself had been articulating this prefigurative politics, so much of the prefiguration he saw mistook the movement or even the subculture for society at large. So we might transform ourselves, or we might transform our local spot, but they're rather ephemeral. He argued that anarchism had lost sight of this kind of broader transformative ethos, that we didn't just need community spaces, as important as those are, we needed political organizations that could contest power and that could link these nodes into a dual power that would create like a revolutionary rupture. And I think second to that was he was very concerned to see how much anarchism would retain a certain state focus where it kind of lost, especially the alternative projects, lost sight of how embedded they are within capitalist social relations. Just because you go vegan, just because you have a radical bookshop, you don't just magically step outside of capitalist social relations. You have to pay rent, you have to pay or not pay your workers, you have to do all these things that I think a lot of anarchist counter projects often didn't quite acknowledge, and they just wanted to jump too quickly from here into then, and he wanted to retain this kind of, you could call it an old left notion of like, yes, we want to prefigure the good society, but we also want to build towards a rupture with it, not just have our own autonomous communities.
Anybody else have a question? Yeah, okay.
I missed what you said about an alternative to consensus. Could you just maybe speak on that?
I think that the whole question of sort of what kinds of decision-making power, you know, is a difficult and a complex question. And you see people really grappling with that question, even people like who are, you know, sort of somebody like, say, David Graeber, you know, who is an anarchist and who supports consensus, but who says increasingly that there are fluid notions of that. Exactly what consensus should be is not, it doesn't necessarily mean that, as we saw during Occupy, you know, one person can block. If you have one person blocking, then you often basically have a rule of the minority, or, you know, so what Murray advocated was voting. He actually advocated majority vote. However, he felt that it was very important, first of all, only after extensive debate, you know, only after everybody was heard, and always with the idea that you preserve the right of the minority to continue the debate, and, you know, in the future, to try to make its position known, to continue to try and influence the majority. So it was partly, I think, also because ultimately these forms of organization have to work on some level. You know, if you can't, if you are continuously sort of stymied by an inability to come to a decision, then you really don't have a workable form of an organization.
I would just add one thing. I mean, in part, I think his critiques were not like abstract or theoretical, but they were also informed by his experience in the Clamshell Alliance and the new social movements of the 70s and 80s, which largely used consensus, and he saw these informal hierarchies emerging that you then couldn't challenge because there were no formal leaders that you could hold accountable. And there's this great essay, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, that some of you have probably read before, which kind of talks about the problem of unaccountable power. And I've heard this from a lot of folks, you know, that were once diehard consensus advocates. After Occupy, they kind of were exhausted by exactly this. And these both charismatic leaders on the one hand, you know, people's ability to make obstructions on the other. And I think, you know, Murray really saw the majority rule in a way was a way to protect the minority. So there was also, you make decisions, but it was also easier to change those decisions. And he always wanted to like make very clear institutional arrangements, you know, of power. That unlike many anarchists, he didn't think that you could abolish or do away with power. The best you could do was organize it in a more emancipatory, more egalitarian way. So he was always concerned with, you know, thinking how that would look. The Tyranny of Structurelessness by Joe Freeman.
Thanks for your discussion. I was wondering what, if anything, and this maybe ties into the first question, which is about how it pertains to social media as a democratic problem. Do you like the talk about, you know, Facebook, Twitter, blog, etc., ways of communicating commentary on positions? Because in a way, in my mind, it's very connected to sort of like a personal aesthetics of expression and lifestyle, and yeah, how maybe this volume or his broader themes connect to this problem.
think that's a good question. I really don't know because, he didn't really write on it. I don't think he ever said anything about it. It was just taking off right when he died. But my sense is that he would probably see it as a form of false participation. And I think he often had a kind of like a cultural critique of some of these neoliberal forms of participation. It was quite, I think in my estimation, sometimes he overstated it, sometimes he got a little bit too curmudgeonly on those factors. I think there's other aspects you could point to that are actually positive about that. But I don't know, I think it's a really good question. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think it relates in another way to a broader discussion about direct democracy, and Murray was a strong advocate that it had to be face-to-face direct democracy. It couldn't be mediated through, ballot initiatives. It couldn't be done by Neil Postman's direct democratic program, you do it through TVs or computers now. And he was very much against this. And I think those are actually things we could, for myself, not Murray, explore. I don't make such a fetish of the face-to-face necessarily, and I think that could tie into the social media component. And also looking at how it's been used in these revolutions recently is very interesting, but it also, I think, highlights some of Murray's dynamics, that it's very easy to have a consensus veto on something or to get rid of something. It's much harder to then replace it with something that actually is different. You change the content and not the form.
I'll just add one thing to that. First of all, what Blair said is true. Unfortunately, Murray died before social media really took off. And I'd like to think that he would have really appreciated the positive aspects of it. Just the tremendous sort of the flash way that people can communicate, that ideas can be shared, that you can sort of rally great numbers of people around issues, that it just has a tremendous mechanism for not only sharing ideas, but sort of cross-fertilizing ideas. But I think what Blair said about face-to-face democracy is true also in the sense that it can't take the place of that. And part of that, I think, is because what I want to emphasize is, and what I've been so excited about watching the Rojava revolution, is that when you are engaging in your community on a face-to-face level, there's a certain kind of energy and excitement and empowerment that comes from that never quite comes from, adding a new post to your Facebook page, or just tweeting something. And so I think that, part of what happens in the community in libertarian municipalism is that in a certain sense we recreate ourselves, we reclaim our subjectivity, and we engage when as society hopefully is transformed, in a social sphere that becomes ever more exciting and ever more powerful. And that can't really be replaced by social media, although I think social media has a huge role to play right now, and it certainly isn't going anywhere.
When you were describing, when you were describing libertarian municipalism, you talked about the Popular Assembly as a red line that Murray saw throughout history in different, throughout revolutionary history. And I'm wondering if there are more, perhaps specific characteristics of the Popular Assembly that he identified beyond just masses of people gathered to make decisions. And if so, what? And if the fact that revolutionary history is necessarily a history of things that happened in the midst of pitched social conflict, and does that color his idea of what the assembly is or is not?
Well, Murray used historical examples. Of course, one of the things that he was very involved in the last years of his life was writing a 4-volume history social revolutions, and he had even before that done an extensive history of the Spanish anarchist movement in Spain. And so he looked, for example, at what happened in Spain in 1936 and how the potential, how anarchists had the potential, well, for a couple of months actually really held power and sort of ended up ultimately giving up that power. And then of course there's an example of the Paris Commune. And there are the examples, even locally in Vermont, for example, town meeting is still a very unique but democratic tradition that lives on today, in which people get together every year, every March, the first Tuesday of every March, and make decisions about their communities. So certainly there are examples of how you can begin to actually try to institutionalize this kind of power. He's talking about, with Libertarian Municipalism, working initially on the neighborhood level and then kind of expanding and ultimately trying to really create a countervailing power to the state so that each time the assembly or eventually city council gets more power, it essentially usurps the power of the state. And I think that, it's interesting that you're seeing that kind of thing happen of all places in Rojava. It's one of the exciting things that's going on right now. And, it would be nice if we could start to maybe put some organizing energy into creating those kinds of community assemblies here in this country.
I would just add that I think he saw them also, as Debbie mentioned earlier, he was very concerned with finding the forms of freedom, what institutional forms. I think he saw these as ideal institutions for self-management, for self-governance that happening on the local level. That's, in these times of social conflict and social revolution, neighborhoods, quarters banded together, both to defend their gains in their neighborhoods, but also to run society themselves from, their neighborhoods. These were institutions that were neither the state, they weren't parties, but she was very concerned not to see this devolve up into a professionalized political class where politics becomes something done to you, not that you do yourselves.
Well, this is very interesting. How do you identify when you have a group of individuals or of a city? How do you identify what are the criteria to select the issues that you are going to focus on? Does this book have some sort of a set of criteria, say this, and this, and so according to this criteria, we should focus on employment or racism or violence or something like that? What could be the criteria to identify that issue if you want to maintain openness and participation? Thank you.
Well, I think the first set of criteria, in a sense, is what does the individual assembly concern itself with? And to begin with, it might be something very simple. In Burlington, Vermont, there was a local Green Party, which Murray was involved in. And it focused on some real specific community issues, like, for example, saving the Burlington waterfront from development, from putting hotels on it, and saving the environment from a gigantic power plant that they wanted to put in. So sometimes the issues will present themselves. And sometimes I think people will have ideas. My sense that one of the things that goes on in some of the communities that are trying to implement these ideas again, in northern Syria, is that people bring to the community their concerns. And sometimes you have subgroups. You know, there are women's councils there too that have the ability to veto issues, even decisions taken by the community that concern women, because the women ultimately preserve their rights. So I think under different circumstances, it'll be different things. And that you start with whatever is significant to the community, and then you discuss it, vote on it, and maybe take up other issues.
I have a question concerning ecology. You mentioned that there was some debate between Earth First and Murray, and I was interested in how they differed from each other and on which kind of natural philosophy or natural science his account of ecology was based, because you briefly mentioned balance and this idea of diversity, and or you mentioned it, and there was some like the idea of totality, that there is a cause, it has effects. So this seems pretty, let's say, hippie natural science. So I was interested if this is the Green Party or whatever at this time. And it seems to me in a contradiction with this community thing, because ecological problems today are on a global scale, and if I decide with my community on some water fountains, that's pretty good. But what we are facing is a more or less apocalypse where communities are wiped out and nobody knows who is accountable for that and who should be accountable for that. So I can't really relate this to, and maybe you can just elaborate on this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it does go back to those debates. He was very concerned with authoritarian forms of ecology. Earth First at the time had come out in favor of immigration restrictions, especially for brown people from the South, made a bunch of racist comments. Population control, he was very anti-misanthropic forms of ecology, which a lot of, Earth First was associated with the ideology of deep ecology. Social ecology saw it not as like a biological problem or a population problem, as a social problem, especially the problem of capitalism. So I think he was very concerned with not going with an authoritarian statist approach to solving these problems. And in terms of like this actual social theory of ecology, whereas deep ecology kind of wanted to put all biological life on an equal plane, his argument was that you have first nature, you have second nature, and that humanity was first nature rendered self-conscious, and then in fact, whereas people like Dave Foreman would say, we have biocentric species equality. Murray said the only species that's even capable of taking into consideration its effects on other species are humans. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about anthropocentrism, because actually humans are the only people that can even consciously decide how our behavior, how our social relations will impact other species. Bears are ursocentric, wolves are wolfocentric. That is just their nature. So it's kind of a tautological, ecological theory, I guess. Just about also confederation, I think, was a very important part for him. It wasn't just parochial, local, direct democracy. It was also confederations building up. Because how else can we do it? We want an authoritarian response. I think a lot of liberals these days are showing their authoritarian face that they're so scared of the ecological crisis that they're willing to say, okay, hey, we need only a God or a Godzilla can save us, or a Leviathan can save us, and I think that's a really scary proposition.
I want to emphasize what Blair said about first nature, second nature, and what Murray called free nature. One of the things that I think is most important about Murray's thinking, or at least as his kid, one of the biggest influences that he had on me was to sort of see the world dialectically, to remember that things aren't fixed in one way, that we're constantly in a process of change and of becoming. And that in that sense, human beings, this idea that we see ourselves, well, there's nature, wilderness out there, and then there's evil human beings who are messing up the planet. And I think we have to be really careful about that. Naomi Klein now has a new book out, and it's wonderful that she's saying that capitalism, she's putting that right out there, that capitalism is on a collision course with the climate. But this idea that somehow we are inherently opposed to nature, what Murray said is, we are nature. We are nature rendered self-conscious. We have an ability, a duty, a responsibility, and also this tremendous potential to actually intervene in the natural world, not to step back, but to intervene and create a rational society. A society that fulfills, that not only allows us to steward nature and to make sure that we're living on in a healthy and safe planet, but that actually allows human beings to truly realize their potential for freedom. That it's really all about freedom. I mean, there's no accident that he called his magnum opus the ecology of freedom. That's what that's about. And the other thing that I just want to add to that is sort of in terms of the question of confederation. Always he emphasized that, some people criticized him and said, well, if you have a community, what's going to stop them from dumping a pollutant into a river that, doesn't bother them, but it goes downstream. But again, he emphasized the idea of that in confederalism, the communities would work together to solve regional problems, and that it was in everybody's interest to have an ecologically sound environment, and that in the future there wouldn't be, hopefully, there wouldn't be this notion that somehow, because we would not have capitalism, there wouldn't be this notion that somehow I take whatever I can, this rapacious sort of attitude. And one of the things that and you can fend for yourself, but that we really all do better when we engage in mutual aid, when we have an ethics of complementarity. And one of the things that I just wanted to mention is I just came back a couple of days ago, actually, from being in Italy. And in Italy, I've noticed that communities are really taking huge steps to sort of enter the breach because of climate catastrophes. There's been flooding, there was the earthquake in L'Aquila, now there's been flooding in Carrara and Parma and other cities that exist along rivers, and they see that the centralized government just isn't responsive and is just indifferent, basically, and then it's been a tremendous opening for people on the neighborhood level to start forming their own organizations and really thinking about how they want to reshape their communities.
I actually wanted to ask a question and kind of push a little bit on confederation and confederalism. One of the things that folks have been talking about Murray's ideas with, really appealing. But there's this question of what happens at scale, and it's not like a way down the road question, because if you're thinking about how to apply this in a city as big as Baltimore, certainly in a city as big as say New York, you can't imagine a face-to-face democracy, right, at city level, right? So you have to imagine neighborhood assemblies, and in fact we've seen plenty of examples of neighborhood assemblies springing up in places like Argentina and so on. But anyway, the question of how do these assemblies coordinate and form something that can address problems at scale, and how does that differ from a state? And I think this is, I recall David Harvey maybe brings this question up of well, if it walks like a dog and it quacks like a dog, right, doesn't that make it a state, right? Walks like a state, quacks like a state, right? What is the difference in the way these larger units are formed that makes them embody a kind of freedom different from, say, we send a representative somewhere and then they tell us what to do if we get out of line?
Well, one of the things that I think is critical is to recognize that these kinds of organizations really have to contest the power of the state, and therefore can't be based on sending a representative to power. That Murray makes a distinction distinction between statecraft and politics. And he makes a distinction between the way decisions are made and how decisions are implemented or administrated. And I think that, and therefore, so it's not that you can't have expertise. It's not that you can't have somebody who is an engineer and would know how, for example, to take care of implementing a sewage treatment plant. But those people don't make the decisions. Those are the technical experts who implement the decisions. And in every case, every decision that's made, and also in the sense of confederalism, if you send a representative to meet, sort of the way the spokes councils did during Occupy, in every case, that representative is accountable and responsive to the group that sent them there. And those groups have the ability to veto any decisions. So they're not allowed to make decisions. It's never a question of saying, I'm going to vote for so-and-so and hope that they actually fulfill the wishes of the community. The community decides, the representative simply discusses with other representatives and then always comes back to the assembly or the group. And I think it's important to, to recognize that that's a very different model from representational government, and that we're seeing that representational government has really been a dead end for political activism. I lived in Germany in the mid-'80s, and it was right at the height of the big debate within the Green Party, the West German Green Party, between the fundamentalists and what they called the Realos, the Realpolitik. And, it was really interesting. And the Realpolitik people, Joschka Fischer and those people insisted that they would be able to enter the Bundestag and actually still be accountable to the base. And what you see now is that the Green Party, and the Fundis, of course, argued the opposite. And what you see now is that the Green Party is really like any other party, and that people make those kinds of compromises. And I've seen that also in Vermont and here in the United States. Claire, do you want to add anything?
One of Murray's most popular examples was the Paris Commune, which even at the time it occurred was over 1 million people, and then they managed to coordinate. And this is in a time, before the internet and all these other technologies, which I think also have some role to play, I guess, especially as we talk about these bigger issues of scale and transnational organizing and confederation and coordination, especially when it comes to some kind of a democratically planned economy.
Do you have other questions? Anybody hasn't asked a question yet? Okay.
Yeah, I guess I have kind of a corollary question to John's, which is particularly after renouncing the label anarchist, did Murray's opinion of the use of force in politics change? And, coercive force, policing, enforcement, special bodies of army people.
Yeah, I think they did actually. I think near the end of his life, he took a more of a civic Republican turn. He started looking at issues of constitutionalism, of law. He started, talking about the need for clear guidelines by which to organize society, enshrined in the Constitution, by which you could hold other communities in the Confederation accountable to, including the use of force. For example, Debbie's example, if you're upstream and you're part of the Confederation, you're polluting, you're poisoning your neighbors and federal comrades, then yes, there is the justification to use force in these cases. And he also, I think, when it came down to discussions of, of course, we would all hope that building a dual power would be large enough, democratic enough, that it would be a majoritarian, largely peaceful revolution. But he also, insisted that the left needs to learn to use arms, and that it probably will not be peaceful, that the state will probably attack revolutionary communities and confederations as a threat to its own power. So I think he definitely warmed up to issues of being called coercion. That's a little bit extreme, but imposing a democratic we arrived at mandate on people who signed on to this.
Any other questions for our speakers? Yeah.
I just have a question, like your opinion, like since Murray's passing, have you seen, noticeable change or different reception of, his ideas and things that, where he wasn't around to have these heated debates with, Zerzan and Dave Foreman and things?
Yeah, I think definitely it changed. As John mentioned, his first impression was, this curmudgeonly guy who hated the punk anarchist types, and maybe that's, those books are still around, but maybe that's not the first impression people get. Now I think, especially recently, the first time people are hearing about this in context of PKK, which is pretty exciting to see it being taken up in a totally radically different social context, which is funny. We have Ursula Le Guin wrote the preface because, she and Murray had a correspondence in the 80s, and she was very influenced by Murray's work, and so came Stanley Robinson. Murray was always held up as this, the pinnacle of utopian social theory, and yet here it is being enacted in the most, extreme social conditions possible in the midst of a civil war against, these complete, fascists, modern-day fascists, and here they're putting these things into action. So I think that's definitely changed the reception, and I think, Debbie mentioned David Harvey, a Marxist academic who's rediscovered Bookchin lately and has been writing very nice things about him. I think there's kind of a renaissance of interest. He was really a wide-ranging thinker. It was a great book. It was already 10 years ago. Russell Jacoby's The Last Intellectuals, where he was kind of lamenting that, people like, anarchists like Noam Chomsky are household names, but everybody loves Chomsky, but he kind of writes the same book every year, whereas Murray wrote over 25 books, a vast range, was a really novel thinker, and I think that's actually going to only increase with time, and that's one of the hopes we have with this book, that we can introduce him to the audiences and people that have never heard of him before, and get it outside of the kind of anarchist ghetto that some of his works languished in for a long time.
Debbie, any last words?
I think that Blair is right in saying that a lot of the kind of contentious parts of Murray's work that were really predominant in the 90s are being put into perspective now, and that there are some people who are doing some very critical work on Murray. I want to just mention, for example, Damien White wrote a very lovely and comprehensive review of Murray's work. It's called Bookchin, A Critical Appraisal. It's a Pluto Press book. And Andy Price has done a really tremendous job also. That's a New Compass book that's called Recovering Bookchin, in which he specifically looks at these controversies, the anarchism and the deep ecology, and really tries to sort out sort of what the issues were and where the caricature of Murray and sort of where it became personal on the part of a lot of people who, for whatever reason, decided to sort of personalize a lot of these issues. And he's done a great job in that book. So I think that there is now a new appreciation of his work, and I think that, the thing that I would emphasize the most, I think, is that, we're really at a critical point. We've always been at a critical point, but now more than ever, there's something very exciting about what's happening in the streets. There's something very exciting about what happened with Occupy. There's all over the world, people are really calling for direct democracy. And so the question is how to make that call and that dream and that vision a reality. And I think that once again, as Noam Chomsky says on the back of this book, he has, a remarkable talent in many different domains, and was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. And I think that these essays actually can be really instructive. And so it's my hope that people in the left and beyond will actually consider them and debate them and and hopefully move the movement forward.
Great. Well, I want to thank our speakers for coming. I haven't personally warmed up to coercion as much, maybe, as I will in later years, but I do want to strongly encourage you to buy a book. Buying books is how we're able to keep this space open to do all sorts of free talks like this. So please stick around, grab a glass of wine, grab a cookie or something, buy a book, talk to the editors, they'll sign it, they'll talk to you about Bookchin for as long as they can hang around, and please join me in thanking them for coming.